quite a lot to say on American Magic, and well, there's just so much to discuss after today's racing. But even before now, there's a lot going on that boat, and it's actually a really interesting story. Because some ways for me, before we get into details, my general feeling is they have a boat which is capable. We saw in the World Series it was probably the best of the Challengers boats, and we're seeing now it has got legs, but for whatever reason, and we're going to get into that, they are just not converting the potential of that boat at the moment. So let's try and start on something positive. I'm not sure if you'll have anything for this, but what was the best call of the weekend for them? Silence.
I think the biggest positive that American Magic can take from this is that they are fast. And I think their average speed around the track was higher than Ineos today. They've got the smallest foils, and we saw that as a big weakness on the second day. But then that did appear to be a pretty good strength today. And Terry Hutchinson talked about this in the press conferences. That they just think that 10 knots is really that transition period where you go from below 10 knots, big foils are nice, but anything above that, and it's just a progressively larger delta. So they've gone down a route where they're looking for that top end speed. They're willing to take the risk on the sub 10 knot racing, and they kind of demonstrated that. And while Ineos had very good fortune in the way the races fell and who they raced in what conditions, American Magic really had the worst of the luck over the last 3 days. They had their 2 race day in the middle in the really light conditions, which are their weakest area.
Yeah.
They lost on the first day in conditions that might have been at least even, but that wasn't a boat speed thing. That was just a race where they were really in the race. They just hadn't identified that right-hand side as being so favoured, and they made a few splits to the left and lost more distance, which they then just couldn't recover. But there was no problem with the boat. They were sailing fast.
Yeah.
And then,
we talked about it just on the phone this morning, didn't we, how Ineos are maybe a little bit flattered in terms of who they got to match up against and when. And it's basically the polar opposite for American Magic, isn't it? They're just, in terms of who you'd like to race in which wind strengths, they really got snookered there.
American Magic are interesting. It's not just they've got a slightly different take on the foils to the other Challengers, but they're using different technology in the sails. So their sail supplier, it's hard to say if they're a supplier at this level of sailing, but their partner on the sails is Quantum Racing, whereas the other teams are using North Sails technology. So there's the actual physical materials things made out of, but there'll also be a different take on the CFD and modelling that sits behind that. But they've obviously come out with something that's fast in the conditions that they've moded the boat for.
I think their design team, hats off to their design team, because the boat is a good concept, and it, like you said, it's hit its design goals. And what we're seeing is maybe the design goals were set a little bit high for some of the racing we're going to see in terms of the expected wind strengths. But the very positive news for American Magic is that the hardest thing to find is just boat speed, whereas other stuff in terms of team choreography and communication can be fixed. Right, let's talk about something negative about their setup.
Well, we talked in the crew roles about...
I think it's got to be crew roles, hasn't it?
It's got to be crew roles.
It's a big issue for them.
So American Magic have quite a fluid setup in that their tactician, Terry Hutchinson, is on the pedestal on the port side. They've got a flight controller on the starboard side who's giving them kind of strategical, big picture information. But a lot of the split-second decisions are made by Dean Barker on the helm. And I think in the World Series, a lot of the decisions that Dean was just making it's things like, do we tack here or in a bit? Well, ultimately, that decision doesn't matter that much if you're fast. And I think over these last 3 days, we saw him overruling Paul Goodison and Terry quite a few times. And I don't think any of those overrules worked in their favour.
No, I mean, I'm a helm, you're a helm, and there is always that little bit of anxiety when someone on the boat suggests something to you, and there's no easy way, polite way of overruling someone, is there, when you're in the heat of the moment and you just need to be clear, no, we're not doing what you suggested. But as a helm, you better hope that, when you do overrule people, you got to be getting it right a lot of the time, otherwise you will lose the confidence of the crew very quickly. And I think that is really starting to happen with American Magic.
There's no doubt in my mind that if this were not sailing, if this was, say, Premier League football, and we'd seen decision making like we saw from American Magic over the last few days, there would be serious questions being asked.
Yeah.
Like, if you lose 3 matches in a row, the manager's getting fired.
Yeah.
And I think it's too easy to just gloss over these things and say things like it was a lottery on the second day.
Yeah.
Like they've actually got to take some responsibility for the mistakes. I'm sure internally they're doing that, and the public face that we see is not necessarily what's going on internally in that team. But
yeah.
And also, as you have suggested, speed is hard to find. Things like this can be solved in one sit-down meeting where they just agree to change their approach slightly. Yeah, it's an hour's work, and they can do this.
I think the other thing I'd like to see fixed is, in the American Magic crew roles video, we talked about Terry Hutchison and how, they've got 8 grinders and they've managed to sneak on a tactician as a grinder, and that's good because you're filling the tactician role, but you're also having the extra grinder. But as it's turned out, Terry either isn't seeing enough because he's got his head down grinding, and he's not giving that much information to Dean, and when he is, Dean's kind of overriding it. But I think part of that is maybe Dean Barker obviously knows that Terry's grinding and probably doesn't have the best view, so maybe Dean's just not confident in what Terry's seeing, and Terry can't get his head up enough to give really confident advice to Dean, in the way that when Giles says to Ben to do something, it's never kind of like a weak suggestion. It's always like, oh no, this, it just comes across really confident. Because I think, Terry Hutchison's a really, really good tactician. And surely if they can get his head up out the boat a bit more, even if that means he's not grinding so much, that should be something that they could fix.
I agree. If Ineos can get the power they need from pretty much 5 grinders most of the time, it does feel like it wouldn't be a big switch for American Magic to have Terry sitting in the leeward helm seat in the way that Giles does. And then he can even take the helm out of the tacks. But it's so much harder to make good decisions and to know what's going on all the time if you're doing 80% of max heart rate spinning the handles. Yeah.
And I even wouldn't mind it if he's still in the same position in the boat and he gives the handles a push, if they are short on power, and then the rest of the time, to be honest, it's very easy to, if you're on a 2-man pedestal, it's very easy not to pull your weight, isn't it?
Yeah,
you can rest your hands on there.
That's what I do anytime I've ever touched a pedestal.
I think we've said quite a lot of negative stuff for them, but fixable stuff.
I think everything's fixable, isn't it, with these teams? And there's so much data, there's so much video feeds, position information on the foils. They've got teams of people trawling through this.
What, this video right now?
They're probably they've all watched the Ineos Gaines video.
Yeah.
And actually, a big shout out to the AC commentary team who have clearly been watching Mozzie Sales recently, and it was good to see them up their game with the footage today.
Yeah, they were definitely calling out some of the stuff that we'd been picking out on, which was either a coincidence, but either way, it's nice to see the commentators kind of picking up on some of these more finer details. I'd like to say something positive about American Magic in terms of their boat manoeuvres. They had a couple of good lee bow, or not a couple, maybe one good lee bow tack today on Luna Rossa when they did get into the lead. That was nice to see. Let's talk about negative boat manoeuvres for them, and I think this one's easy to call. Which do you think was their worst boat manoeuvre, Rob?
Well, I mean, the one that has arguably written off their boat and given the shore team a very difficult job for the next few days. Rule number one on these things is keep the mast pointing in the sky.
This is genuinely terrible scenes. I'm gutted for them because I desperately want, 3 very competitive teams, and it's horrible to see something like this happen. But what you didn't see in the race footage was they had a huge hole in the bottom of their boat, and I'm told, these are the rumours coming out, that hole was caused by the foil cant system battery becoming dislodged and firing through the bottom of the boat when they splashed down just before the capsize. Looking at the photos, that'll flip one up on the screen, but that's a horrible amount of damage they sustained in that capsize, which that damage shouldn't really have happened. But it's always a chance, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and we saw in the practice racing before this, Team New Zealand flip over and they get a support boat to them pretty quickly, tow the thing up, drop the sails, towed back to the dock on the foil, and they're out racing the next day, no problem. So they've been pretty unlucky on American Magic there.
Where do they go from here? Where do American Magic go from here, apart from a lot of bog to plaster over that hole?
Well, I think that really is the first challenge. American Magic have got to stay in the America's Cup. So they've obviously got a huge hole in the boat. There's probably some structural damage. So the boat builders have got a lot on this week. The entire boat also looks like, the hull is underwater. So there's going to be a lot of electronic componentry in that boat that is just fried. So they're going to have to go through every single component and either replace it or steal parts off their other boat. And it does mean that there's going to be no sailing for American Magic between this round and the next round, which starts next Friday.
And it just couldn't be worse timing, could it? Before that capsize, they were probably thinking, if we can just get through, win this race, get a score on the board, and then we've got next week to start making changes, start evaluating the kit we've got, the way we've got the team set up. But instead, now they've got this huge distraction of re-rigging a boat and plastering up a huge hole in the side. It's just terrible for them, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess those guys are going to have to get in the simulator and they're going to have to spend the time working on those communication issues that we think they have. Yeah,
that much is evident. Whether there's something technical they need to do to reduce the power demand so that Terry Hutchinson can get his head out the boat more, I don't know.
The power issue to me, I just can't see that's the factor. Terry Hutchinson is obviously a fit guy in his 50s. I would be astounded if he's doing more than 150 watts average for a race.
Yeah, whereas I've seen people like on Ineos, I think Neil Hunter was quoted as doing over 400 watts for 20 minutes, which is
that's substantially more than substantially more than we do on a bicycle, and we're not terrible on the bicycle. But
no.
But if it is in the region of 150 watts, even if it's 200 watts average, which I'd say is good going, well, the other grinders just have got to pick that up.
Yeah.
It's only the other guys have only got to do 20 watts each more, and then they're more than making up for him. And Terry can use his biggest muscle. It's his brain. That's what you've got him on the boat for. His brain, like, he's so experienced. That's what you've got to be utilising.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think Dean Barker's a very easy person to criticise because he was like, they've obviously had a bad moment. They had that massive turnaround in the San Francisco Cup when they went from 8-0 up to 9-8 losers. And then he was effectively offered a shore position at Team New Zealand, seemed to have a fairly acrimonious departure from Team New Zealand. So he's kind of one of the old guard there. And I can't imagine the Kiwi press are giving him the easiest time. He was then a defector to the Japanese team. So he does have a bit of a recent track record in America's Cup of losing. And even when they were sailing the version 5 boats, when they had the Coots group defection to Alinghi and Dean took over as skipper, they lost 5-0 in the first final. So he may be very talented, but as far as the kind of the wider public are concerned, they look at a chap who has a very good losing record in America's Cup matches.
Yeah.
But you don't. I mean, again, also Dean's mid to late 40s. How many Formula One drivers are we seeing mid to late 40s?
I think he's 48.
Yeah, and
I
do question that a bit.
Yeah, he's obviously, look, all these guys are incredible sailors. However, really good, that's fine. But this is the America's Cup.
I agree. I think you look at the other helms and their track record outside of America's Cup is just vastly superior. Right.
I think that's enough bagging on Dean Barker.
Let's carry on.
Yeah, no, let's call it a day there. Yeah, looking forward to getting some more shit America's Cup chat videos out over this week. We're going to dive into some of the more kind of technical details on the various boats as well. Those sort of insights or wild speculation is kind of what the people like. But we'll try and keep up the content for you all. Yeah, we'll sign off there. Thanks.